Welcome, everyone. So today I want to talk about React. Who is let's see a show of hands, who is a full stack developer, or call themselves a full stack developer, I guess, who does front end as well as part of their day job, who uses some React? Yeah, almost everyone who said, they do some front end as well. So great. Hopefully you will find this session valuable. So before we begin, so this talk is about, some common anti-patterns in React that I have observed. But before we begin, who am I? So I'm Ersel, and I work as a full-stack JavaScript consultant in the UK. And I've been doing this for a few years. And for the last few years, a few of my clients were like being fintech companies, software as a service solutions, and been focusing more on the front end and React skills on the last 2 years. And on top of that, I also teach at a local coding bootcamp called Manchester Codes. It's like a part-time coding school. So I have taught maybe like 60 people how to program in JavaScript, and also like taught them some React skills as well. And some of my students, ended up getting jobs as junior developers. And apart from that, I, help organizing some local meetups in Manchester called Microservices Manchester, and another one dedicated to JavaScript called Monk.js. Right, let's begin. So, scene number 1, I call this the tightly coupled components. So, what are tightly coupled components? So, we had this input field in one of the projects that I was working on. It was called the first name field. And let's take a closer look into what props this input field takes. And if you look at it, you will realize, it takes this form API, right? And then we look into the component itself to see how form API prop is being used within the context of this component. OK, it's used in another component and it's passed down to onChange and onBlur callbacks. And you go form API on change, form API on blur, and it's also passing some get value, has error. So you can see it's relying on this form API prop, quite a bit. But what is the form API? We have no context at this moment, right? So to figure it out, we need to go to the parent component, which makes use of this component. So let's do that. Then you will realize, OK, this, this input field is used in the context of this form. And if you take a closer look, you will realize form API is a render prop provided by this form component, right? So this input name field, although it's like abstracted away, put into some like separate component or whatever, you can't really use it without the context of this form. It needs to live within this form at all times. Well, OK, you say, it actually gets better. In the same code base, we had this component, which was like annual entitlement in another input field, but it would rely on the form API. But now people had the, the luxury to pass some other props in as well. So like it takes form API, it takes update entitlement, and some other props as well. And how is it used within the context of this component? You look at, this form API on change, but the onBlur callback for this input element, it actually relies on the update element, update entitlement prop. So it's making use of both the form API and some, custom functions as well. You might think, do I need to call the form API onBlur in this instance as well? I don't know. Who knows? Nobody knows, right? And why is that bad, this type of coupling? Well, you can't really use these input fields without the form instance. You need to make them live within this form component, otherwise they are useless. And the whole point of creating this React component is to make them reusable. So that's kind of like an anti-pattern if you are kind of like having this tight coupling between. And the other problem, most likely, is that if you were to unit test these input elements, obviously, any changes to the form API, you wouldn't be able to capture it because probably in your unit test, you're just going to mock the form API. And if you make the actual implementation of the form API change, you wouldn't see that, OK, this component will break because it actually relied on this particular implementation, right? Right. And OK, scene number 2. prop glutton, I call this. So sometimes components get, eager. They want to basically have access to so many props. And let's have a look. So we had this component called progress steps in one of the projects. And the idea is that you have this like wizard type of thing in the user interface. It will have step 1, step 2, step 3. And at each step, it would show the user, or you are on step 2. It will be highlighted a bit differently, maybe. And this type of component. And let's see what it takes as props. So progress step component used to take an array of steps. OK, that's reasonable. Then it takes current index. Then it takes current ID. You might think, OK, all right, let's see how we are using these props. So it maps over the steps. So obviously, it needs to render each of these steps. Then it needs to figure out if the wizard is completed, which is a simple check. If the iterate is less than the current index, we know you are still in progress of this filling this wizard form in. And to highlight the current element, it would go and do this check saying, oh, is the current ID is equal to step.id, right? Then they say, OK, this is highlighted. You are on this step 2. You are on step 3. OK, but you might realize, hold on a second. Can you not just do I equals current index, right? So because you are iterating over, can you not just tap into the current index rather than going current ID? So once you pull this out, you can basically, refactor your component, and you realize you don't need to pass the current index and also current ID, So then you can drop the current ID prop from your component, and that's it. So pay attention to existing props that are passed to a React component, because sometimes people just completely ignore the existing props, and they say, oh, I need to implement this functionality. What do I need for this function? I need to pass this in and do some check and render this. Cool. But can you actually achieve that behavior with some of the existing props and derive the information that you need rather than passing a new prop in? You are polluting the prop interface, the interface of this component. So what can be derived should be derived as a fundamental design principle. Right. The sin number 3, the state greedy components. So that's also a very common mistake I think beginners make in React. They kind of try to put everything in state rather than just treating them as props. So we had this component called header day picker panel. It was used as part of a day picker component we had. And let's have a look what this panel component used to do. So it had this initial state declarations. So it had to know about the selected day. It used to know the month. It used to know the range that you're selecting. You say, OK. Then you go, oh. If you see this method overridden, your spider senses should start tickling, get the right state from props, You shouldn't need to override this in very rare instances, You shouldn't need to do that. But, so this one was overriding this method as well. Then it was defining this callback function called set month year. And let's have a close look on line 30. It goes this.setState and sets the month, right, to be the day that's been selected. That's fine. But on the very next line, on line 31, it goes this.props set month, right? OK, so you have set the month, in the context of this component, you're setting state to store the month. But then, on the very next line, you go and tell your parent about it. Hey, I set the month to be this. You might like to know about this, OK? But who is the owner of this piece of state then? Do you maintain it, or your parent maintains it, right? So there's a bit of confusion about this state field and where it should live. And we did refactor this component. And actually, all that information can go away. This component didn't need to have any of that state, right? It should just be driven by the parent. It should be a control component. Parent dictates what the value is, what the month is, and you just interact with setting the props. Cool. And sin number 4, this is a very subtle one. It's called the visibility prop, I call it. And we had this model component within our code base, and it did things that you would expect from a model to do, like setting the body overflow hidden or show, and then it had this render block, where it will create a portal and attach a new model to the DOM directly. But if you look at the beginning of the render block, it had this if, like conditional render check, right? It would go, oh, if is not open, then return null, right? We do this like almost everywhere. And it's a very subtle one. And why is this bad to have this kind of conditional rendering? Well, it's bad because although you return null from your render block, this component actually gets mounted. It gets mounted. It needs to get mounted because it will come with all the class and all the graph around the class as well. So there's a better way of achieving this behavior without having conditional render check within your render blocks. What you can do is you can simply pull the conditional render check to the parent component. So in your parent component, you could go, oh, is open, then render the model. So don't delegate the visibility to the component itself. Pull that behavior up to your parent component. That means the model won't get mounted into the DOM. It means it won't pollute your memory space. Right? It has no memory impact if you do it this way. Right. The next one, the sin number 5, is inconsistent naming. So, this is a bit pedantic, but I sometimes see people do things like this: import lists from view. Right? Okay. You're just being lazy. Just name the component to be view, or change the name of the file to be list or something, but use one name. Right? Because when I need to navigate my project structure, now I need to, if I want to find the list component, I need to find the view file and look at that. That's not nice. Just rename it, please. Right. Okay. So here's a complimentary photo of Dan Abramov, and continuing on. So now we have talked about the state, the props, and also we mentioned Dan Abramov. The React called it Trinity. Now I want to talk about a few things about testing React components as well. But I want to start with a confession, a personal confession. So I used to be a non-believer, right, when it comes to testing, and also when it comes to testing using snapshot testing. Has anyone tried snapshot testing feature of Jest? Yeah, a few people. Yeah. So I used to, hate snapshot testing. I thought it was, it's not right because for a few reasons. So I thought, oh, that's not TDD at all. It has kind of this arrogance to it, saying if you're doing snapshot, or my current implementation is the state of universe, that's it. That's the right way for this component to be in. So I didn't like that. And it felt like a bit like cheating because it's so easy. You can go like, oh, too much snapshot, bang, my job here is done, right? But yeah? What? Why is that? Okay, let me try. Is that any different? That's a bit better. Okay. Technical difficulties. Yeah, you see that? Right. Okay. And which slide do you see? Yep, snapshot testing. Okay. Okay. Just going to continue from this onwards. Right. So I said, it's not like really TDD. And I thought, it's like cheating because it's so easy to do, snapshot testing. You got too much snapshot, that's it. Right? But, fundamentally, I didn't trust people. I didn't trust people to say, oh, when this snapshot fails, are they going to read the failures and look into them, and kind of investigate why it's failing, rather than just going, oh, you update the snapshot, it's fine, Yeah, and I think the main problem for me was that, people could go, okay, maybe they want to test this form component. They would go, oh, yeah, find the form. This is using the Enzyme library, by the way. So it goes like, oh, find the form rendered in the component and too much snapshot, right? And the snapshot file will be saved with the rendered component and how it looks. So it would look something like this. That individual test scenario itself would end up being 60 lines long, right? And then, when something fails, who is going to read all these differences, right? So that's what I call the overzealous snapshots. So people put snapshots, they are maybe too generic, and they are too big, and, it becomes harder to work with them. Then I seen the light. I found, okay, you don't need to do this. Actually, there's a better way of using snapshots. And I think that's going a bit like, being specific about what you are going to put a snapshot against. So you go, okay, I'm not going to put a snapshot against the full render tree. If I'm interested in this prop initiated in this spanner, I'm just going to put a snapshot against the prop, right? So that kind of helps with your keeping your snapshots nice and tidy and small. So in that instance, in this test case that we have seen, you can actually take that 60-line snapshot, and all you are interested in is only 10 lines of snapshot. That's it. And when this fails, people can easily see the differences. So say, okay, this attribute used to be a number, now it's a string, or something like that. Right. So now I believe snapshot testing can be a force for good if you use them, granularly and sparingly. Be specific about what you want to test. Right. And the last one. So I call this intimacy with Enzyme. Enzyme is a good testing library, and I guess most people who are doing React kind of default to Enzyme, but it can give you too much power at some instances. So I have seen instances like this. People go, oh, I want to, test if I click this, I want the components to disappear, or they go do things like this. Okay, oh, component set state, hide all true. So they are saying, oh, I want to hide all the assessments or whatever, and I see nothing in the list. And they also go and put assertions against the state itself. So they might go, expect component state.assessments to have length 0, right? So this is possible with Enzyme. So you're directly manipulating the component state, internal state, and you can actually put assertions against the internal state, right? And I think that's the anti-pattern. And if you have seen the React testing library by ContainerDays, is an alternative framework to test your React components, and it's developed by ContainerDays, and I realized after compiling the slides, actually React testing library doesn't even allow you to do anything like this. They say, no, you can't tap into this state. You shouldn't know about the state, right? So, oops. So the black box testing aspect is, I think what you should be testing instead is that you need to test that when you trigger a particular prop, right? I click this button and it runs this on click handler, and I want to see whether the rendered component tree has changed. So instead of looking at the state or setting the state directly, you would look, okay, how does the render change when I do this operation? That's what you should be testing. Because when you think about it, if you are putting your assertions against the state directly, somebody goes, refactors this component, renames a state field. Why should your test fail? Why should they fail? The behavior shouldn't change, So you should be testing the behavior of the component, not its internal workings, right? So in summary, we talked about, tightly coupled components, make sure your components are reusable, prop gluttony, make sure that your, props that you are relying on, there are no existing props that you can derive the behavior that you are after, and make sure that state, is higher up in the clouds, close to heaven in your React component tree, and try to avoid visibility props. Pull your conditional rendering logic higher up rather than putting it in render blocks at the component level, and make sure the naming of your components and the file system is consistent. And use snapshots sparingly and specific. Be specific about what you want to put a snapshot test against. And then don't get intimate with the internal state when you are testing a React components. And yeah, that's all. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Has anyone seen any, common anti-patterns they have come across that they want to share? I like hearing some horror stories. Anyone? Yeah, I don't know. I heard some people say, "Oh, in my place, there are some components which do direct DOM manipulation as well as doing the classic React render lifecycle methods." Cool. Thank you.